So here's something that happened in November 2024 that most people missed entirely. A series of unexplained seismic events were recorded in the Baltic Sea. Not earthquakes, not naval exercises, something else. The monitoring stations picked up the signatures, logged them, and then silence. No official explanation. No press releases. Just quiet technical notes in maritime databases that most people will never read. But within weeks of those seismic events, Finland quietly announced it was building an undersea power cable to Estonia that would bypass all Russian territory. Then Sweden announced a similar project. Then Poland. And if you're paying attention, if you understand how infrastructure works and how nations actually project power, you realize what's happening. Europe is rewiring itself to survive without Russia, and they're doing it underwater where Moscow can't easily see it coming. Let me take you back for a moment because you need to understand what Europe's energy infrastructure used to look like. For decades, the architecture ran east to west. Russian gas flowing through Ukraine, Russian oil moving through Belarus, Russian electricity grids connecting directly into the Baltic states. The whole system was designed during an era when economic interdependence was supposed to prevent war. The theory was simple. If Russia supplies Europe's energy and Europe buys Russia's energy, neither side can afford conflict. Mutual dependence creates stability. That theory died on February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, and Europe woke up to a terrifying realization. It had built its entire energy security on infrastructure controlled by an adversary. Every pipeline, every gas storage facility, every electrical interconnection that ran through or from Russia was now a potential weapon pointed directly at European cities. So what do you do when you realize your energy supply is a loaded gun in someone else's hand? You build new infrastructure, fast, and you build it in a way that can't be easily controlled or cut off by Moscow. Enter the Baltic Sea. Right now, as we speak, the Baltic seabed is becoming the most strategically important piece of underwater real estate on the planet. Finland and Estonia are constructing what will be the world's longest undersea electrical power cable. 200 kilometers of high-voltage direct current transmission line running across the Gulf of Finland. When it's complete, electricity will flow between the two countries completely independent of any Russian infrastructure. But that's just the beginning. Poland is building massive offshore wind farms in its territorial waters, with undersea cables connecting directly to Lithuania and Sweden. The Baltic Ring Project, that's the official name, aims to create an entirely independent electricity market for the Baltic region by 2026. Independent meaning no Russian involvement, no Russian leverage, no Russian ability to flip a switch and leave an entire country in the dark. And then there's liquefied natural gas. LNG terminals are sprouting up all along the Baltic coast. Finland has one. Poland has one. Estonia is building one. Lithuania already had one and is expanding it. Each terminal represents a permanent alternative to Russian pipeline gas. Ships can deliver LNG from the United States, from Qatar, from anywhere. The infrastructure is flexible, diversified, impossible for any single nation to control. Germany, and this is remarkable. Given Germany's historical relationship with Russian energy, Germany is actually demolishing the physical infrastructure for Nord Stream 2. That pipeline cost $11 billion to build. It was completed, but never operated because of the war. And now, Germany is taking it apart. They're not mothballing it. They're not keeping it in reserve. They're removing it permanently. Because even the possibility of future Russian gas dependence is now considered a national security threat. But here's where this gets complicated and dangerous. Every one of these undersea cables, every pipeline, every data connection being laid on the Baltic seabed, they're all vulnerable. Extremely vulnerable. They run through international waters that Russian naval vessels patrol. They pass near Russian territorial seas, and they're completely undefended. In October 2023, the Balticconnector gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia was severed, just cut. The official investigation concluded that a Chinese cargo ship, the New Polar Bear, had dragged its anchor across the pipeline, damaging it beyond repair. But here's what makes that explanation suspicious. The ship's route was unusual. It had departed from a Russian port. Finnish investigators noted that the anchor would have had to be dragging for dozens of kilometers to cause the damage pattern they observed. And the ship's crew claimed they had no idea it was happening. Accident? Maybe. Sabotage? Possibly. Warning shot? Almost certainly, because it demonstrated something very clearly. These undersea connections are exposed. They're critical. And they can be cut. And then there's Nord Stream. In September 2022, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines were destroyed by underwater explosions. Not damaged, destroyed. Seismographs across northern Europe registered the blasts. The pipelines were ruptured in multiple locations simultaneously. It was clearly deliberate. It was clearly sophisticated. And to this day, it remains officially unexplained. Various investigations have been launched. Sweden conducted one and classified the results. Denmark conducted one and was extremely vague about conclusions. Germany is still investigating. The theories range from Russian sabotage to Ukrainian special operations to third-party actors trying to permanently sever European-Russian energy ties. Nobody knows for certain. Or if they know, they're not saying. But here's what we do know. Somebody demonstrated the capability and willingness to destroy critical undersea infrastructure in European waters. And Europe is now building dozens more of these cables and pipelines in the same vulnerable location. Think about what that means strategically. Russia is watching its primary leverage tool, energy supply, being systematically dismantled. Every cable that gets laid, every LNG terminal that opens, every wind farm that starts generating power, it reduces Moscow's ability to pressure European governments. Russia's leverage is measured in megawatts and cubic meters of gas, and that leverage is evaporating. So Russia faces a choice. Option 1, do nothing and watch your geopolitical influence drain away as Europe completes its energy independence infrastructure. Option 2, engage in sabotage operations against these undersea systems. But Option 2 comes with massive risks. These aren't Russian pipelines being attacked. These are NATO member state infrastructure projects. Finland just joined NATO. Sweden just joined NATO. An attack on their energy infrastructure could potentially trigger Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause. That's the one that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. So every undersea cable being laid in the Baltic is simultaneously a declaration of independence from Russian energy and a potential tripwire for the largest military alliance in history. And it's not just energy. It's data. The Baltic Sea floor is increasingly crisscrossed with fiber optic cables carrying internet traffic, financial transactions, military communications. In November 2024, 2 separate undersea data cables in the Baltic were damaged within 48 hours of each other. One connected Finland to Germany. The other connected Sweden to Lithuania. Both were cut in Swedish territorial waters. Swedish authorities launched an investigation and tracked a Chinese commercial vessel, the Yi Peng 3, which had been in the area when the cables were severed. The ship was detained, questioned, and eventually released. Again, the official explanation was possible anchor dragging. Again, the pattern seems almost too coincidental to be accidental. Here's the thing about undersea cables. They're incredibly difficult to repair. When one gets cut, you have to dispatch specialized ships, locate the break, Retrieve both ends from the seabed, splice them together, and relay the cable. It takes weeks. And during those weeks, traffic has to be rerouted, capacity is reduced, vulnerabilities are exposed. Now imagine a scenario where multiple cables get cut simultaneously. Not just one or two, but a coordinated attack on 5, 10, 15 critical connections. The Baltic states could be digitally isolated from the rest of Europe. Financial systems could be disrupted. Military communications could be degraded. It would be a form of hybrid warfare that sits in the gray zone between peace and open conflict. And Russia has the capability to do this. Russian submarines regularly operate in the Baltic. Russia has specialized vessels designed for undersea operations. Russian naval intelligence has detailed maps of every cable and pipeline on the seafloor. The capability exists. The question is whether Moscow believes the benefits outweigh the risks. But here's the other side of this. Europe knows all of this. European militaries are not stupid. They understand the vulnerability, and they're responding. NATO has established a new maritime surveillance operation specifically focused on protecting undersea infrastructure in the North Atlantic and Baltic Sea. Patrol aircraft, naval vessels, underwater sensors, all coordinated to detect and deter interference with these critical systems. Finland and Estonia have announced joint naval patrols around their undersea power cable project. Poland is deploying underwater drones to monitor its offshore wind farm connections. Sweden has increased its submarine presence in the Baltic to levels not seen since the Cold War. What you're watching unfold is an entirely new domain of geopolitical competition. It's not about controlling territory or even controlling sea lanes. It's about controlling the infrastructure that enables modern civilization to function. Energy, data, communications. The cables that carry these things are becoming as strategically important as the Fulda Gap was during the Cold War or the Strait of Hormuz is today. And it's happening in the Baltic Sea, a relatively small, shallow body of water surrounded by NATO members on almost all sides. Russia has access through St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, but Russian vessels operating in the Baltic are essentially surrounded by NATO capabilities. Every Russian submarine that leaves port is tracked. Every surface ship is monitored. Russia can cause disruption, certainly, but it cannot operate freely. It cannot dominate. It's a confined space where NATO has overwhelming conventional superiority. Which brings us to the real question. What happens when Russia's leverage disappears completely? When the last Russian gas pipeline is replaced by an LNG terminal? When the electrical grids are fully independent? When even the data cables bypass Russian territory entirely? Russia becomes strategically irrelevant to European energy security. Not diminished, irrelevant. And for a power that has spent centuries leveraging its natural resources to maintain influence in Europe, that's an existential threat. The infrastructure being built right now in the Baltic Sea represents the permanent architectural exclusion of Russia from European energy systems. It's not sanctions that can be lifted. It's not diplomatic isolation that can be negotiated away. It's physical infrastructure that will exist for 50 years or more, designed from the ground up to function without any Russian involvement whatsoever. This is what the end of energy dependence actually looks like. Not a policy declaration or a political speech. Heavy machinery on the seabed. Cables being laid. Turbines being installed. LNG ships docking at new terminals. The quiet, methodical construction of an alternative system. And Russia is watching it happen in real time, with limited options to stop it and enormous risks if it tries. Every cable that gets successfully installed is another percentage point of leverage lost forever. The economic weapon that Moscow spent decades developing is being neutralized by undersea construction crews and offshore wind engineers. The Baltic Sea is becoming the world's most expensive and most strategic extension cord. and somebody has to protect it. Because the next war in Europe, if it comes, might not start with tanks crossing borders. It might start with mysterious equipment failures on the seafloor and sudden darkness in cities that depend on connections most people don't even know exist. This is infrastructure as battlefield. This is energy independence as existential threat. This is how power actually shifts, not dramatically, but cable by cable, meter by meter, beneath cold water where most people will never see it. But it's happening. Right now. And the implications reach far beyond electricity bills or gas prices. Because when you change who controls the infrastructure, you change who controls the future.